Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of My Face. Today we're going to continue our series that looks at the lesser known starships of Star Wars factions by looking at lesser known starfighters used by the Rebel Alliance. In Star Wars, it seems like the interceptors and multi-purpose starfighters get all of the flash and glory, whereas fighter-bomber designs are more or less forgotten and uninspired. I mean, the TIE bomber is just the TIE fighter with an added compartment for bombs. The Y-Wing was used by 3 generations of good guy factions with very few changes and updates, and any alternative the Rebels had were ridiculous, like the B-Wing. Well, after the success of the Y-Wing, Kongstar Manufacturing tried to basically capitalize on the design's popularity by designing other assault fighter bombers. This is where we get the BTS-A2 long-range strike fighter bomber, otherwise known as the H-Wing, because like the Malline Cloud Car, there are 2 cockpits on this design. One cockpit was for the pilot, and one cockpit was for the gunner and weapons officer. Now, there was one huge design flaw with the H-Wing, and that is the controls in the cockpits were not redundant. And so if you lost the pilot cockpit, you no longer could steer the ship, or if you lost the weapons cockpit, you no longer had weapons. Either way, it was a pretty bad situation when that happened in the middle of a battle. The H-Wing was pretty heavily armed though. It had much more weapons than the Y-Wing, and only the B-Wing had more firepower in the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps. Now, the H-Wing was also a bit slower than the Y-Wing, but luckily it had much thicker armor and very heavy deflector shields. There are many in the Rebel High Command who believe that the H-Wing should have replaced the less than reliable B-Wing, which is also really awkward to fly. But ultimately, it came down to cost and manpower. The H-Wing required a crew of 3 and is twice as expensive as most single-seater fighters like the Y-Wing. Sorosub Corporation was the pride of the Sullustan species. With the rise of the Empire, Sorosub remained loyal to the new government in order to protect their holdings. But eventually, as the Galactic Civil War kicked into a higher gear with the Battle of Yavin, Sorosub would defect after Sullustan rebel hero Nia Nub staged a hostile corporate takeover of the company. Now, Sorosub at this point in time was a pretty well-diversified company, but it mainly relied on mining and heavy industry. During the Galactic Republic period, Sorosub developed their own starfighter to protect their local business interests, the Cutlass 9 Patrol Fighter. This is a 12-meter-long hyperdrive-equipped short-range interceptor. Sorosub would supply the CIS during the Clone Wars, and also a few of these ships would make it into the hands of the Jedi Starfighter Corps as well. Jedi Master pilot Sassy Tin was known to fly such a ship. It should be noted that even before Sorosub officially defected to the Rebel Alliance, they were covertly supplying these type of patrol craft already to the Rebel Alliance. You guys probably know that I'm not a huge fan of the B-Wing design, but I do kind of like the H60 Tempest, which is considered kind of the precursor to the B-Wing. The H60 Tempest bomber was created by Slane & Corporal, a Verpine starfighter manufacturer who was also responsible for the V-19 Torrent starfighter. The H60 bomber was shaped like a single wing, and it had 2 detachable cockpits on either side, one for the pilot and one for the gunner. Now, originally, the Verpine tried to sell the H60 alongside the V-19 Torrent starfighter to the Galactic Republic, but the Republic would reject the H60 design because it was kind of confusing for its non-insect clone trooper pilots. So, unfortunately, Slane & Corporal would not find any prospective buyers for their H60 Tempest bomber, and the ship basically sat in the scrapyards. Until 15 years later, when the genius Mon Calamari engineer known as Corey drew inspiration from the H60's design along with the V-19 Torrent starfighter and came up with the Blade Wing prototype, which of course would eventually become the B-Wing. Also, much earlier, around the time of the Battle of Yavin, the Rebel Alliance was already using refurbished H60 Tempest bombers, which were actually the original ones first designed by Slane & Corporal. Built specifically for the Jedi Starfighter Corps, the Delta 7 Aether Sprite Light Interceptor represented the pinnacle in starfighter frame design. This was a highly maneuverable and extremely simple ship design. The Jedi used the Force to help aid their flying, so many of the usual pilot aids you might see in a starfighter like this are actually missing. The Delta 7's hull was so thin and sleek that the astromech socket on the fighter could only fit the head of a standard astromech, which required the pilot to heavily modify their droids in order to bring them along for flights. Now, the Delta 7 Ether Sprite would eventually be replaced by the ETA-2 Actus class interceptor, which was a much more well-rounded starfighter. The Rebel Alliance, however, would acquire some of these mothballed Delta 7s, and they would join the early versions of the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps. The R-22 Spearhead, also known as the R-22A Wing, was a state-of-the-art experimental starfighter designed by Quad Systems Engineering towards the end of the Republic era. It was actually designed as one of the potential replacements for the Delta 7 Ether Sprite we were just talking about. The R-22's small wedge-like frame was extremely durable and light and allowed for record-breaking speed and maneuverability, but was considered too expensive and unnecessarily high performance by the Galactic Empire for mass production for their own navy. And so the majority of the R-22 prototypes would actually fall into the hands of the Tammuz-An Planetary Defense Force. The Rebel Alliance eventually got their hands on these R-22 prototypes and found it highly customizable. They switched out the engines and installed new shielding and weapons and created the beloved RZ-1A Wing. Still, the original R-22 would see some combat in action in the Rebel Alliance fleet. Although Poe Dameron once remarked that the original R-22s were almost like stunt flyers because of their extreme maneuverability and lack of flight aids and normal military equipment. The Rebellion also created a variant of the RZ-1 known as the RZ-1T, or the RZ-1A Wing Trainer. The only difference it had from the standard A-Wing was an additional seat for an instructor in the back of the already really cramped cockpit. Whereas the X-Wing was relatively easy to fly, especially for those with experience in the INCOM line of starfighters, the A-Wing was a death trap for inexperienced and lesser skilled pilots. Its legendary speed and maneuverability meant that only the pilots with the fastest reaction time and most skill could actually safely fly this ship without getting themselves hurt. So the RZ-1 Trainer was a great way to kind of ease new pilots into this platform. The Rebellion heavily relied on snub fighters to project its fleet's power and capability. This also meant that they needed a decent reconnaissance starfighter to scout out new locations and systems where they can base their operation at. While the Rebellion was known to run some Clone Wars era INCOM ARC-170 recon birds, the T-65BR X-Wing reconnaissance bird was actually purpose-built to do this, and it was a lot newer and a lot cheaper to operate than the ARC-170s. The T-65BR is basically a normal X-Wing with an advanced high-gain long-range sensor package and high-speed communication receivers where the proton torpedoes usually sat. The X-Wing could also drop probes and had an advanced imaging system placed onto its nose, which is probably one of the more recognizable features on this X-Wing. These recon birds also heavily relied on a R2R series astromech to help coordinate all of the communication and onboard sensor data. The X-4 gunship was built by INCOM Corporation, and it was supposed to fill a need for a heavy-hitting assault gunboat in the Rebel Alliance fleet. The X-4 had a crew of 8 and was armed with 8 laser turrets, but surprisingly lacked other heavy weapons. And so it was mostly relegated to escort convoys and protect them from enemy starfighters, a job that it was actually pretty well designed to do. The ship's maneuverability and abundance of point defense weapons made it essentially a flying TIE fighter killing machine. The Blob 22 Starfighter is a badass looking ship. It kind of reminds me of a Corvette Stingray or something like that. It's classified as a heavy fighter and was most famously used by General Grievous during the Clone Wars. In my opinion, this was essentially a muscle car pretending to be a starfighter. Its sublight engines were quite large and heavy for a starship of its size and quite inefficient. The Blob 22 also had an abysmal Class 6 hyperdrive. I don't even know why you would bother installing a hyperdrive that slow onto a ship like this. The Blob lacked heavy weapons, but it did have 2 triple light laser cannons, making it quite deadly to enemy starfighters at close range. At the same time, the starfighter had an incredibly tough armor on par with a small gunboat. This was paired with a very powerful shield, which allowed the Blob to survive even the heaviest of enemy fire. The Rebel Alliance would actually get their hands on several Blob 22 heavy starfighters, and they would be used as elite fighters for the Starfighter Corps. Horst & Kessel Drive was a lesser-known starship manufacturing company that was actually quite popular amongst the corpo states in the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Their work includes the Lucrehulk class of freighters and also the Munificent class star frigates. They also attempted to break into the starfighter market with the R41 Star Chaser. It was supposed to compete with the Z95 Headhunter, a very solid income product from before the Clone Wars. This multi-role starfighter had a very flimsy airframe and it lacked good armor, but it was quite maneuverable, had good weapons and speed. The ship also had ion cannons, which allowed it to disable enemy ships' electronic systems. The R41 would only really be used by the Alliance to restore the Republic in the very early days of the war. Once the X-Wing was available, the R41s were essentially phased out. Horst Kessel Drive would follow up the R41 design with the R60 Twing interceptor. This was originally designed to replace the A-Wing interceptor, but the T-Wing would widely be considered a failure. While it had a decent amount of speed on par with a TIE interceptor and not quite as fast as an A-Wing, its maneuverability is where all the problems came in. It just was not able to outturn other ships in a dogfight. The Rebel Alliance would only use the T-Wing for a pretty short period of time before trying to sell them to local planetary defense forces. They just weren't able to perform at the level they wanted to. Anyway, guys, those are 10 separate, lesser-known Rebel Alliance starfighters. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our series. We'll probably take a look at the Galactic Empire or the Galactic Republic next. Anyway, guys, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.